Randolph Scott finally talks about Gabby Hayes when he heard about her. Randolph Scott was born in Orange County, Virginia, on January 23, 1898. His full name was George Randolph Scott. Scott grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a rich and well-respected Southern family. He had a good upbringing and was taught right from wrong. George Grant Scott and Lucille Crane Scott had 6 children. He was the second of their 6 children. His upbringing taught him to work hard and be polite, traits that would later define the roles he played on TV and in movies. Scott went to private schools before going to the Georgia Institute of Technology and then the University of North Carolina to study engineering and business. His family put a lot of value on education and custom. Sadly, Scott's plans to go to school were cut short when World War I broke out. He served with honor in France as an artillery officer in the U.S. Army. This experience not only helped him become a better leader, but it also gave him a strong personality that would become a big part of his movie character. After the war, Scott finally made it to California, where he had planned to start a business career. Luckily, he met people in the acting world through chance, good looks, and ties, especially through his friendship with Howard Hughes's son. Scott got small parts in silent movies in the late 1920s thanks to his tall, athletic build, chiseled features, and smooth Southern accent. In the early 1930s, he got his first big parts. He quickly became known as a reliable and charming supporting actor, and was often cast in romantic dramas and adventure movies. But it wasn't until the middle of the 1930s that he really became famous, thanks to roles in big-budget epics like The Last of the Mohicans 1936 and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm 1938. Scott could play a lot of different parts, but the westerns were where he really shined. By the 1940s and 1950s, he was a western icon, having been in dozens of movies that showed off his steady, straightforward screen personality. Scott's cowboy characters were not flashy or proud like many of his peers. They were strong, quiet men who lived by a moral code and represented the ideas of fairness and strength. Films directed by him, like Colt Chepperfish 1950, 7 Men from Now 1956, and Ride the High Country 1962, became fan favorites and are now thought of as classics in their field. In the late 1950s, he worked with director Bud Butcher on a famous set of 7 westerns called The Ranone Cycle. These movies added to his reputation as a western legend. These movies weren't just boring shoot-'em-ups. They were character-driven stories with deep psychological depth that raised the genre. Randolph Scott had been in more than 100 movies by the time he quit acting in 1962. Most of whom were from the West. Many people think that his last movie, Ride the High Country, was a touching and appropriate send-off. In it, he played an old lawman who has to deal with the end of the Old West, which was a lot like Scott's own exit from Hollywood. Fans and critics alike praised the movie for how it made them feel and how religious it was. Many people think it's one of the best westerns ever made. Randolph Scott was married twice in his life, but the 2 marriages went very differently and brought different things into his life, which was otherwise very private. His first marriage was to Marion DuPont in 1936. She was from one of America's wealthiest and most powerful families and had a very impressive background. Marion DuPont was the daughter of William DuPont Sr., and her family tree went back to her great-grandfather Eleuter Iron DuPont de Nemours, a famous French-American businessman who started E.I. DuPont Nemours and Company, better known as DuPont. The DuPonts were a wealthy and powerful family, especially in Delaware and Virginia. Before she married Scott, Marion had already made a name for herself in the horse racing and charity worlds. At the time, their meeting and ultimate marriage was the stuff of celebrity dreams. As a funny aside, Marion had married a man named George Somerville before, and Randolph Scott was the best man at that wedding. This was an early example of how the social lives of the rich elite are often complicated and intertwined. They were married for a short time, but it didn't last. They got a divorce in 1939 after being together for 3 years. While the official reasons for the breakup were never given, rumors included lifestyle differences and emotional incompatibility. This was especially true since Scott was focusing on his film business in Hollywood and Marion was dedicated to her horseback riding and estate life on the East Coast. The couple didn't have any kids together, and their breakup was said to have been friendly. It's interesting that Marion kept using the Scott last name after her split for the rest of her life. It was an interesting choice because she lived longer than Randolph's second wife and died in 1983, almost 50 years after her marriage to the actor ended. This choice could be a sign of lasting affection, social comfort, or a desire to stay connected to a name that is linked with class and fame. A few years later, in 1944, Scott married Patricia Stillman, an actor who was 21 years younger than him but was beautiful and poised. This was his second and last marriage. It would be different from his first marriage. This one would last and be good, with both partners feeling stable and careful. Scott's friend and backer from the height of his career well into his retirement was Stillman, who wasn't as well known in the public eye as Scott. They had a peaceful home life together and decided to adopt 2 kids, Sandra and Christopher, in 1950. Their family stayed out of the Hollywood glare as much as possible, which shows how determined Scott was to keep his public life separate from his private life. Friends and co-workers often said that the Scott-Stillman home was quiet and elegant, and that it was a safe haven from the shallowness and chaos that often came with show business marriages. Randolph Scott was one of the most recognizable faces in American westerns, but he was very private about his personal life. He didn't like having his private life shown off to cameras or the media, and this distance from them added to his mystery. But people who knew him well knew that he kept up a group of close friends. Fred Astaire and Cary Grant, 2 Hollywood legends, were among them. His relationship with Cary Grant was especially interesting because it lasted so long and still interests film researchers and fans today. The 2 stars met on the set of Hot Saturday in 1932, and they quickly became very close friends. Soon after, they started living together in a beach house in Malibu that became widely known as Bachelor Hall. They did this off and on for about 12 years. Their living situation, which lasted well into the 1940s, was written about in a lot of fan magazines and gossip columns of the time, along with pictures of the 2 main men sunbathing, playing tennis, or taking it easy by the sea. A lot of people started to wonder about how close and friendly their relationship was, which led to decades of discussion about what kind of relationship they had. Some biographers and cultural critics see their relationship as a close friendship that helped each other during a time when public pictures were closely watched. Others have suggested a more romantic side, pointing out that in the 1930s and 1940s, the entertainment business often pushed stars to hide who they really were behind stories made up by the studios. Scott and Grant's relationship stayed strong even after they stopped living together in 1944, the same year Scott married Patricia Stillman. The truth is probably somewhere between love, respect, and privacy. For decades, fans of old Hollywood westerns wondered what Randolph Scott and Gabby Hayes' real relationship was like. Randolph Scott was the tough, good-looking cowboy who became the face of honor and strength in frontier movies, and Hayes was the rough, quick-talking sidekick who added grit, humor, and warmth to many movies. During the golden age of westerns, they were both in a lot of movies set in the same world, but both men have been very quiet about their relationship off-screen over the years. While they were quiet, there were rumors, guesses, and a lot of Hollywood myth going around. But in a rare and deeply moving interview near the end of his life, Randolph Scott finally talked about his work and personal relationship with Hayes. This cleared the air for everyone and gave fans a long-awaited look into Scott's life. The dusty paths of movie scenes are where an interesting friendship began. Scott said that working with Gabby Hayes was one of the best things that had ever happened to him in his job. Not just because Hayes is a terrific character actor, but also because he is a man of great honesty and loyalty. Gabby was more than just a jokester. Scott said he was the real deal. He was a cowboy all the time, not just when the cameras were running. He wasn't lying in any way. He talked about how much he admired Hayes's natural sense of timing, his skill at stealing a scene without taking away from the drama, and his unique ability to give people life when they might have been written off as stereotypes. Scott said that Gabby had an uncanny knack for making people laugh 1 minute and cry the next. She brought a depth of feeling to every movie they worked on together, he said, but Scott's comments were about more than just respect for his job. He talked about a close relationship that grew quietly out of sight of everyone else. The two men became close because they both loved the American West, its past, its values, and the rough freedom it stood for. During breaks, they would often talk about politics, horses, how Hollywood was changing, and even the philosophical basis of the Western genre itself. No matter how they were raised, Scott was a well-educated Southern gentleman with a patrician air, while Hayes was from the working class and had a colorful past in theater. They had something in common. They were both devoted to making their work truly real. Scott also said that it made him very sad that the press sometimes thought of Gabby Hayes as just a character player or sidekick. Even though Hayes was a major influence on the Western genre, he made it happen. Scott said that many of those stories would not have had heart without Gabby. He was the trail's heart. This comment showed Scott's rising anger at how Hollywood often didn't recognize the work of supporting actors who carried whole scenes and gave unrealistic heroes more depth. One of the most moving parts of the talk was when Scott told a story from one of their westerns. When Hayes stood up to a studio boss who was being rude to a young crew member, he put his own job at risk to protect someone who couldn't defend themselves. It was that person, Gabby, that Scott said, a man who wouldn't back down when it mattered, just like the characters he played. Scott really liked this trait and tried to show it in his own life, on and off the screen. Fans of both men saw Scott's revelations as an emotional and long, overdue tribute to a beloved co-star whose presence lit up the screen and whose reputation had been overshadowed by more traditional leading men. His words made a picture of Gabby Hayes as a man with strong morals, a strong sense of duty, and a generous heart, very different from the rough-looking, beer-sporting sidekick he played in movies. Breaking his silence was a way for Randolph Scott to honor his friend and remember Hollywood and its viewers that greatness is often found in the people who aren't in the spotlight. Randy Scott, one of the most famous Western movie stars in Hollywood, died on March 2, 1987, at the age of 89. He died in the peace and quiet of his Beverly Hills home, which is where he had spent most of his retirement years away from the limelight. The stated cause of death was a mix of problems with the heart and lungs. These health problems made the actor, whose tough, athletic image had defined an entire era of American westerns, weaker over time. In spite of his health problems, Scott kept his privacy and respect. He spent his last years with family and close friends, away from the busy life of Hollywood. When Randolph Scott died, he was buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he grew up. This final resting place was very important to him because it was where his family had roots and a return to the Southern soil that had shaped his values, personality, and on-screen image. The beautiful, historic grounds of Elmwood Cemetery became a fitting memorial to the man who had played tough honor and frontier justice in more than 60 movies. His funeral in Charlotte added to the idea that, despite his fame, Scott never forgot where he came from or the good-natured Southerner he played on screen so often. Scott's personal life was shaped by his long and happy marriage to Patricia Stillman, an actress and socialite who he married in 1944. They were married for 43 years, which is very long for a couple in this town, where relationships tend to end quickly. The couple had a strong, private bond based on love and respect for each other. Patricia was Scott's loyal partner throughout his work, and after he retired, she often went to social events with him and was his emotional support. When she died in 2004 at the age of 91, she was buried next to her beloved husband. Their graves represent not only a lifelong marriage, but also a shared history of grace, tradition, and understated beauty. In Beverly Hills, the couple lived in a beautiful mid-century modern home that showed the style and sophistication that had become a part of their life. With its clean lines, wide open areas, and touch of Hollywood glitz, the house was for decades a quiet haven in the middle of Los Angeles's busy life. Sadly, this beautiful piece of architecture was torn down in 2008, more than 20 years after Scott's death and 4 years after Patricia's. Its destruction marked the end of an age, which is a sad loss for people who love old Hollywood movies and style from the mid-20th century. The house was not only a place to live, but also a safe place where they could share memories and watch the end of a famous career. Patricia Scott worked hard before she died to make sure that her husband's stories would live on for future generations. The Randolph Scott papers were given to the special collections at UCLA. This was one of her most important moves. This very important archive has a lot of personal things in it, like rare photos, carefully put together scrapbooks, handwritten notes, letters, press stories, and even the original building plans for their Beverly Hills home. The materials give a personal look into the life and work of a man whose calmness on screen hid a thoughtful, private, and deeply reflective person. This collection can now be looked through by scholars, fans, and researchers who want to learn more about the life and work of a movie legend who helped define the American Western. In life and in death, people still remember Randolph Scott for more than just the parts he played. They also remember him for the way he lived his life. He was respectful, loyal, quiet, and deeply committed to his beliefs. His story, which has been passed down through historical items and family stories, is still a moving part of Hollywood's golden age.